So when we think of Nineveh, we probably think of Jonah. In a sense, from now on, after this study, you will think of Jonah and Nahum. You will think of them both together. But it's hard for us probably in 2026 to think back and really think about how significant Nineveh is in the life for a Christian today. And the evidence, the importance of the evidence of Nineveh. That's probably, we don't really have a full concept of it because we live in this century, not centuries past. We're going to have a look at that today. Because as we've grown up, the story of Nineveh has probably been recounted in stories of Jonah and the great fish as we've covered. And for our lifetimes, the existence that there was this historical place called Nineveh, we've probably not given that much thought. Did Nineveh really exist? Probably hasn't been a question that's entered in our mind. However, the story of Nineveh, and particularly its disappearance and then reappearance in history, is one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of archaeology and evidence for the Christian faith. For centuries, the existence of Nineveh actually served as a primary battleground between secular historians and defenders of the Bible as God's truth, as that the Bible is true. And we may have heard in our lives, we may have heard someone come to us and they say at some point, you can't prove the Bible. And we may have had someone come to us at some point or other who says, you can't prove the Bible's just a matter of faith, it's just personal belief, your personal preference, and you can't prove it. I disagree. I think you absolutely can prove the Bible. Now, whether we'll accept the Bible as true, or whether we'll accept the Bible in what it says, that's another thing entirely. But can you prove it? Absolutely, I believe you can. And that's one of the things we're going to have a look at today. And we're going to start in Nahum 2, verses 1 and 2. This will be pretty linear. If you have your Bible with you, you can follow along. It's going to be pretty linear today from Nahum 2, from 1 all the way to the end. The one who scatters has come up against you. Keep watch over the fortress. Watch the road. Bind up your waist and summon all your strength. For the Lord will restore the splendour of Jacob like the splendour of Israel, even though destroyers have laid waste to them and ruined their vines. Okay, the one who scatters has come up against you. Now, in a physical sense, this is going to talk about the forthcoming attack by the Medes and the Babylonians, who are going to come against the Assyrians at Nineveh as God's instrument of destruction. There'll be a number of civilizations that will invade here, conquer and utterly destroy Nineveh. But in the ultimate sense, the one who scatters is God himself. God himself is against the Ninevites. Nahum 2's bookended here. We'll see this in Nahum 2:1, and we'll also see it in Nahum 2:13. God is against Nineveh. The one who scatters is against Nineveh. And God's going to punctuate that in Nahum 2 by declaring that the one who is against Nineveh, the one who's going to scatter them in the ultimate sense, is none other than God himself. The Almighty God is against Nineveh. Heck of a distinction for a city to have. Verse 2 describes that Israel has at this time been laid waste, but God will restore the splendour of Israel. Now, while some will interpret this prophecy as a coming restoration of Israel at this time, as the historical return from exile that the Jewish people will see under Persia, that's the return from the Babylonian exile. The subsequent eras of Israel in the land of Israel, which is the Hasmonean kingdom, the Roman occupation, and then the period of exile to the modern diaspora. There was no splendour restored to Israel during any of these subsequent periods. Israel never returned during the period up until 1947, that is, to an independent nation status. And while there's always been Jews living in Israel, even during the time of the exile there was a remnant left there, Israel in the subsequent return from exile never returned to self-rule before 1947 they created a government. And that's even during the Maccabean revolt, where they threw off the religious yoke that had been placed upon them, but they couldn't rule themselves. And Israel, since the time of Solomon, has never matched the physical, the territorial, or the spiritual heights that has been promised under the Davidic covenant or described by prophets such as Amos, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. There was a promised restoration of the splendour of Israel's past years, and this has not occurred in history yet. And when looking at the prophecies in the aforementions of books like Amos, Isaiah, or Ezekiel, and there's others too, it's understanding when there's a prophecy of the return of the splendour of Israel. It's understanding when the disciples asked Jesus after his resurrection whether it was now the time to restore the kingdom to Israel. They'd asked that in Acts 1:6. Lord, is it not now that you will restore the kingdom of Israel? And Jesus doesn't say to them, no, you've misunderstood, guys. Israel was already restored. When you guys came back from Babylon, that's when we fulfilled that prophecy. He also didn't say that there wasn't a time coming that the kingdom would be restored. Oh, guys, you've had that all muddled up. There's going to be no restoration of Israel at all. He doesn't say either of those things. And Jesus is not shy about correcting the disciples when they've got prophecy wrong. He says, it is not for you to know the periods of time or the appointed times which the Father has set by his own authority. That's in Acts 1:7. So the Old and New Testament prophecies of the Jews living in Israel once more, gathered together in their ancestral home. In Isaiah 11:12 he says, he will lift up a flag for the nations and assemble the banished ones of Israel and will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. And that didn't happen at the exile either. When the Babylonian exile concluded, only the Jews from Babylon went back. They didn't come from all four corners of the earth, as it were. And no, that's not a declaration of a flat earth, just in case you were confused. But so there were those throughout history, disciples of Jesus, who believed that there would be a point in history that God would bring the Jewish people from all over the earth back to Israel once again. But even as that has happened in a sense, or is happening, perhaps we could describe, this has not re-established the splendour of Israel as was seen in the times of David and Solomon. So those, depending on your eschatology, premillennials will argue that the promised restoration throughout the Old Testament and New Testament as well awaits a future fulfillment not yet seen, and that will happen during the Messianic age, where Israel will be restored to unmatched earthly glory with the Messiah reigning in Jerusalem. But back to Nahum. It cannot be underestimated. In previous years, most of us live after a birth date. Well, I think all of us. I think I've covered that before. All of us live after 1947. Okay? And it can't be underestimated the level of skepticism that was pointed towards people who held the view that the Jewish people would be gathered from four nations of the world, and they would go back to their ancient homeland. There was a heap of people who said that cannot possibly happen. And yet, there are those that were scattered that have returned to Israel. And yes, there were Jews already there, living as a remnant, as they had since the first time that their Jewish ancestors crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land. But the view was that surely there was no way that any Jews from all over the earth would one day return to Israel. And yet, that even in our own day, that is what we have seen, and that's what we are seeing. Okay, so even there we have a distinct and important prophecy that we should lay hold of. Because today we can underestimate the significance of those who believe that particular view and believe that God had once promised that the Jews would return to Israel, that has actually happened, or is happening. Nahum 2. The shields, this is the people that are going to come against the Ninevites. The shields of his warriors are dyed red. The warriors are dressed in scarlet. The chariots are fitted with flashing steel when he is prepared to march, and the juniper spears are brandished. The chariots drive wildly in the streets. They rush around in the public squares. Their appearance is like torches. They drive back and forward like lightning flashes. He remembers his officers. They stumble in their advance. They hurry up to her wall, and the manlet is set up. Okay, what's going on here? We've got the depiction of a battle here. This is a battle. The shields of the warriors are dyed red. Now, what we should remember here as we start Nahum 3 is we should remember that Nahum is a prophetic book. This was written before any of this happened. It was written, Nahum classically has been acknowledged to have written approximately 50 years prior to Nineveh's destruction. And yet, this seemingly innocuous detail that Nahum describes, that the warriors are dyed red and the warriors are dressed in scarlet, it foretells Nineveh not only that they're going to be destroyed, but who's going to do it. He correctly identifies which nations would be the sword of God's destruction in Nineveh. Red was the signature colours of the Medes and the Babylonians. Historians note that their shields were often dyed red or made of polished copper and brass that reflected the sun, and their commanders wore distinct scarlet tunics to set them apart. And they had great steel chariots, a very distinct technological advancement of the time, and with great caches of weapons, including swords and spears, when they went into battle. They have mighty armourers of steel, another signature of the time of the Medes and the Babylonians. They're the sword of God's destruction, and it will come to Nineveh. And this is a warning to Nineveh. Not only they're going to be destroyed, but who will do it. And in response to this attack, when it comes, the king of Nineveh is going to summon his elite commanders, and they're going to come together to battle, but they will panic. And here the Hebrew text describes a confusion with the officers coming together and stumbling over themselves in a panic as they rush to secure the city walls. They hasten to the wall, and the mantle is set up. That's the siege shelter. That's the shelter that they would set up on the ramparts as they scramble onto the walls and set up a defensive shield, which is mantled as the wooden shelter that would protect defenders from the incoming arrows and siege equipment. So this is what they're going to do, but they're going to do it in a panic. So what this is telling us, it's a description of the battle in very specific detail. Not only that he could have just said, Nineveh's going to be destroyed. No, he's describing the battle that's going to come. And given this specificity here, this would be a good marching order to the king of Nineveh to get your people in order and well trained so they don't panic. Unfortunately, they didn't listen. Oops. That way. There we go. 6 verse 7. The gates of the rivers are open, and the palace sways back and forth. It is set. She is stripped. She is led away. She is stripped. She is led away, and her slave women are sobbing like the sound of doves beating their breasts. Okay, so the gates of the rivers are open. So historical accounts of the destruction of Nineveh, such as those by the ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, probably butchered that one, but that's okay, and archaeological findings of the time, they confirm that Nineveh's location was along the Tigris and the Kosa River, and that was key to its destruction. It was either heavy flooding by the attackers diverting water, or diverting the river waters washed a section away of the massive city walls. They used the rivers around Nineveh as a weapon to breach their defences, which the Ninevites thought were impregnable. They had big city walls they thought no one could get through. Now, interestingly, this attack strategy of using the river that feeds the city as a tool of war is also used in the book of Daniel, when Cyrus the Great captures Babylon without a battle. And that's quite infamously recorded, where he's able to capture battle, and he boasts about it. And Daniel goes out to meet him. He's captured the city, and Daniel goes out to meet him, and he presents him with a copy of Isaiah, which says, "Hello, Cyrus the Great. I said that I said that you were coming," and he's very impressed by that. But that's another story. So that's another time when the river is used to conquer a city. Now in Nineveh, was very cocky, and they were assured that their massive walls that they had for defence would be their protection. But these massive walls of defence are suddenly breached, and in their panic, the palace melts away. Melts away, what's that mean? Well, once the water comes through their outer defences, the mud and brick foundations of the royal structures gave way, and they literally melted and fell down. Melted into the streets, as it were. And the invading army flooded directly onto the palace grounds with nothing to hold them back. And the phraseology used here again describes the absolute panic that happens in a city assured of its defences that are suddenly, literally washed away. Foretold in advance, correct in prophecy and validated by ancient historian who details the account of how the city was conquered. Though Nineveh was like a pool of water throughout her days, yet they are fleeing. Stop, stop, but no one turns back. Plunder the silver, plunder the gold, for there is no end to the treasure, wealth from every kind of desirable object. She is empty, yes, she is desolate and waste, hearts and melting and knees wobbling. Hearts are melting and knees wobbling. And trembling is in the entire body, and all their faces have become pale. Where is the den of lions and the feeding place of the young lions? Where is the lion, lioness, and the lion's cub went with nothing to disturb them? The lion tore enough for his cubs, killed enough prey for his lionesses, and filled his lairs with prey, and his dens with torn flesh. Okay, again, we can just skip over this and think there's images here, but these are, again, very specific descriptions of what was going to happen. These are descriptions of the conquering of Nineveh and also the specifics of both the battle, again, and the aftermath. Nahum compares Nineveh's massive population and military reserves to a vast reservoir. But after the city walls are breached, the water, all the things that were held inside the city, the people and their defenders, simply drain away through the cracks in the complete panic. And the officers and leaders shout out, "Stop, stop!" to try and rally the troops, but fear overcomes them, discipline goes out the window, nobody stops or turns back, and they all run away. And as a result, Nineveh is looted. And much is the loot to get from Nineveh, because Nineveh had spent centuries extracting tribute, taxes and gold from every nation it conquered. They had a lot in their treasury store. And Nahum describes the pillaging that the invading Medes and Babylonians would undertake as they gained access to this endless storehouse of stolen wealth. And we might think that, oh yeah, well that's a pretty obvious detail. Of Nineveh's, if he's forecasting the destruction of the city, it could be that the looting of the city, that's just a given, that's just a guess. He guessed that that's what they do. But he wouldn't know the scale of the wealth that they had necessarily. Also, if a city or town was defeated, it wasn't always necessarily looted, because this would not always be advantageous to the army. For example, if an army had a threat from other foes and had to retreat or pull back, they didn't want to necessarily carry the burden of loot and treasure with them. Also, they would want to ensure that if they got any defensive attack, that the advancing enemy would find no food, shelter or weapons or anything of value on their advance. And as such, some attacking armies, particularly one as ruthless as the Assyrians, would often take steps to burn cities, even their own cities, crops and stores, rather than prevent another army from getting them. Additionally, in the event of an extremely brutal enemy, if you were coming up an enemy, a sworn enemy, someone known for their butcheries or past atrocities, or if a city had committed treason, or if they'd held out so long and that the conqueror wanted to send a message to the rest of the world, do not trifle with us and do not act like these people did, it would often be an order of complete and total destruction. Total erasure from the planet would be required. And if the battle was prompted in the instance of a holy war or an intense hatred, objects deemed blasphemous or corrupting were often systematically smashed or burnt rather than kept. But here Nineveh is described as looted, with the historic detail being that the city was conquered. So the historian tells us that the city was conquered, then it was looted, and then it was destroyed. It wasn't left standing, they destroyed it. And the destruction of Nineveh is complete. And verse 10 uses a poetic Hebrew play on words to describe utter emptiness and ruin, complete destruction. It depicts the physical symptoms of extreme terror of the people. So not only is their city going to melt away, but in the sight of what's happening, the Ninevites' hearts melted, their knees trembled and knocked together as their pale faces beheld the destruction. This is quite astonishing, because the Ninevites were a people who were known for their own malice and barbarity and ruthlessness. And these people who were exceedingly violent as a people suddenly are the faces of cowardice, confusion, and fear. People would tremble before the Assyrian army, and now it's the Assyrians that tremble as the hand of their destruction comes. There's a clear contrast here in verse 11 and 12. Now, historians report that we have the mention of the lion. Now, this isn't a mention to Jesus the lion. This is a historian report that the lion was the primary national symbol of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Assyrian palaces and city gates were lined with massive stone reliefs of winged lions, and their kings routinely bragged about being predatory lions in their depictions of their own war conquests. And Nahum asks a rhetorical question. Where is your lion's den now? The prophet mockingly comparing Assyria's past habit of tearing nations apart to feed its lion's den, or its capital, with the fact that the predator has now become prey and will be completely erased. Verse 13, behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of armies. I will burn up her chariots in smoke, and a sword will devour your young lions, and I will eliminate your prey from the land, and no longer will the voice of your messengers be heard. God describes himself as being against Nineveh. He is in opposition to Nineveh. It is God who is causing this destruction. It is happening at his divine hand and at his will. And while there will be invading armies that destroy Nineveh, yes, there are these armies that come to destroy them, we should have no confusion here. This is happening at God's holy hand and at his holy will. This is what he wanted to happen. And in God's foreknowledge of history, he knew this day would come. The Ninevites' evil didn't rise up against him in shock. He knew that the Ninevites would need judgment here and they would be utterly destroyed. And in a mystery of God's full foreknowledge that allows our free will to choose, his will is done in his timing, at his place, to enact his perfect plan. And his will indeed will be done here and is being done in Nineveh. Nineveh will be destroyed. And in our day, Nineveh has been destroyed. And indeed, what we've seen here, we've seen a depiction, the writing, the prophecy of the complete destruction of Nineveh, its looting, and any survivors that were taken are carried away in sorrow and captivity. Nineveh, this is Nahum's prophecy that Nineveh will fall and will fall completely. And it is important for us to remember again that this is a warning to Nineveh that was written before its destruction. And it isn't a chronicle of what happened after it had happened. It is written approximately 50 years before its destruction. And this doesn't not only give plenty of time for the Ninevites to repent, which they do not, but it also seeks to establish God's eminence over the coming destruction. He knew this would happen. It happened at his hand. Nineveh will be destroyed, and it will be destroyed in the exact manner in which God has foretold through Nahum. Nahum details who the coming army will be, how it will enter the city, what its weapons of destruction will be, and what the response of the Ninevites will be, and what the aftermath of all this destruction will ultimately be in history. Okay. But for us who live in the 21st century, we can read this and go, yep, okay, that's great, grand, that's interesting, fine. But an interesting thing can be overlooked here, and it's worth our time to have a look at it. Because in the 19th century, which is, it's a bit of a while ago, but in history it's not that long ago, in the 19th century there was a fierce debate about Nineveh that had raged. Because Nineveh was only discovered in the 1840s. In history, that's not that long ago. And Nineveh was frequently dismissed by Enlightenment thinkers and 19th century higher criticism scholars as a legendary, highly exaggerated, and entirely mythical city. Nineveh didn't really exist. In fact, no small amount of scholars and intellectuals argued that the presence in the Bible of the Ninevite record was absolute proof that the Bible was fable and myth and was not to be relied upon. Nineveh fell in 612 BC to a coalition of the Babylonians and Medes and also the Scythians, and the destruction was so absolute that the city practically evaporated from human memory completely. And this had also been foretold by Nahum. Nahum didn't prophesy just that Nineveh would be destroyed, that it would be wiped from map and memory. In Nahum 2:13, I will eliminate your prey from the land, and no longer will the voice of your messengers be heard. And in Nahum 1:14, the Lord has given a command concerning you. No continuation of your name shall go on. I will make your grave, for you are vile. This is God's prophecy in Nahum that the record of Nineveh would be blotted out. And just 200 years, how quickly did that blotting out happen? Just 200 years after its fall, the Greek historian Xenophon marched his army directly past the still standing ruins of Nineveh in 400 BC. And he noted the massive partially buried walls, but he did not know it was Nineveh, nor did he reference it as such. Xenophon rather referred to it as an abandoned territory called Mespila. And due to the discovery of the location of Nineveh in modern archaeological times, it was determined by reading back, knowing Xenophon's journey, that what he had actually walked past was not the ruins of Mespila, but there was no place called Mespila, it was Nineveh. So only 200 years after the destruction of Nineveh, already the city had been forgotten. But by the time we reached the modern era, by the 18th or early 19th century, there was no physical evidence that not only did Nineveh not exist, that Nineveh had existed, there was no evidence considering that the Neo-Assyrian Empire had existed. The only sources mentioning it were the Bible and a few fragmentary, heavily romanticised accounts by Greek historians like the aforementioned Diodorus Siculus, who claimed the city walls. So he claimed a lot of detail about it. His writings were very specific. And he said that the city walls were 100 feet high and had a 60-mile circumference. And on modern reflections of enlightened scholars, due to Diodorus's numbers seeming physically impossible, and the Bible largely being viewed by secular critics as a collection of theological folklore and legend and myth, the prevailing academic consensus of the time was that Nineveh was merely a literary invention, a phantom city used as a moral backdrop for other fables such as the Book of Jonah. The claim was Nineveh had never actually existed, and therefore, by reference, the Bible could not be true. And during the rise of historical skepticism in the 1800s, critics used the absence of evidence regarding Nineveh to chide Christians and argue that the Bible was historically unreliable. And there's no way around this for a Christian of the time. There's no way around it, because the multiple books in the Old Testament affirm the existence of Nineveh. Not just Jonah and Nahum, there's other references too. It details its history, its size, and its multiple warnings from God and its ultimate destruction. And Jesus himself in the New Testament, another problem. Jesus himself affirmed not only the story of Jonah, but specifically cited Nineveh as a people who would rise up on the last day and judge the present generation for their belief. So this is a big problem. However, in these prior enlightened times, biblical critics rebuked Christians for three reasons. The size of Nineveh is improbable. The kings of Nineveh, there's no record of them. The biblical timeline doesn't match. There is just no evidence that Nineveh existed. And the book of Jonah described Nineveh as, quote, an exceedingly great city, a 3 days journey in extent. Jonah 3:3. We looked at that previously. And 19th century critics mocked this description, arguing that no city in the ancient world could possibly be that large, and concluded that the author of Jonah was purely writing a fictional, mythical tale. Now, this, of course, argued that Jonah walked 3 days in one straight line, and we looked at that in the previous session in Jonah, Rather than following the pattern of walking described in outline that covers things like Sodom and Gomorrah, the pre-flood era, and Jericho, where the witness would walk covering every part of the city. Jonah walking for 3 days to cover every corner and alley of Nineveh in his journey. Now, the Bible contains a lot of detail. This is a big problem. It was a really big problem at the time. The Bible carries a lot of detail about the Assyrian Empire and Nineveh itself. The Old Testament frequently mentions names of Assyrian monarchs across multiple books. Names you might have heard before: Sennacherib, or Esarhaddon, and Sargon II. For example, in Isaiah 20 verse 1, it says, "In the year that the supreme commander sent by Sargon, king of Assyria, came to Ashdod." So this is mentioned in multiple books of the Bible. And because the name Sargon appeared nowhere in surviving Greek or Roman histories, secular historians insisted the Bible had not only fabricated the history of Nineveh, but also the rulers to give a false sense of historical realism and credibility to the Bible when none of these rulers actually existed. And finally, critics of the time argue that if a civilization as massive and as brutal as the one described in the Old Testament had actually existed, it would have left structural ruins. Where is it? Where are its monuments? Where are its coins? Where's its currency? Where are the records of it across the Middle East? The Bible stating that Nineveh would be wiped out of human record was not only evidence of God's ordained destruction, but it was a convenient edit explaining the lack of record. So that was no good. Well, the Bible tells us Nineveh would be blotted out. Well, that was just added because it didn't really exist in the first place. Now, the rough geographic area hypothesises where Nineveh could have stood opposite Mosul in Iraq, and consisted of only empty, natural-looking dirt mounds, and scholars asserted that the Hebrew writers had merely hallucinated, embellished, or completely fabricated a record that at best might have been a minor tribal kingdom, if it existed at all. So skepticism of Nineveh endured for quite some time. However, in typical fashion for God, all of this skepticism came to a grinding halt in the late 1840s, when French diplomat Paul-Émile Botta and British adventurer Sir Austin Henry Layard began digging into these mysterious mounds at Nevi Yunus and another word I can't pronounce, Kuyunjik maybe, I don't know. Anyway, across from the Tigris River in modern-day Mosul. And what they uncovered stunned the academic world. This is what we would call all of the humble pie. Layard struck the lost palace of King Sennacherib, a huge, sprawling structure with over 70 rooms laved with miles of carved stone reliefs. More uniquely, he found the library of Ashurbanipal containing 25,000 clay tablets detailing the administrative laws, the judicial laws, and the history of the empire. Validation of all of the Assyrian kings were found in clay cylinders explicitly detailing not only the kings but their military campaigns, such as Sennacherib, including his siege of Jerusalem under King Hezekiah, directly matching the geopolitical landscape described in the book of 2 Kings. And Sargon II was also verified as a highly powerful historical ruler. Archaeology revealed that Greater Nineveh, the city of Greater Nineveh, was a huge administrative district encompassing the central walled city and 3 surrounding sister cities of Calah, Rezin, and Rehoboth that's described in Genesis 10. And to walk the entire metropolitan area perfectly matched a 3-day journey. Sir Austin Henry Layard said, "Before these discoveries were made, who would have believed it probable or possible that the records of the ancient world should have been preserved to this day?" So we who live today may never have, you can go there, you can go to Nineveh today, you can go and check it out for yourself. But we who live today may never have explored the destruction of Nineveh that would ultimately occur in the book of Nahum. We might not have read the book of Nahum as we sit here today. But not only is Nahum an important book, because all books of the Bible are important, but the record of the city of Nineveh is exceedingly important, particularly its destruction, which we often overlook, because it shows the prophetic truth and power of God himself. But today we also miss, not only do we skip over the book of Nahum a lot of the times, but we also miss the historical importance of the discovery of Nineveh, a city that suddenly and dramatically disappeared from history, and yet evidenced the Bible as historical truth after decades of critique. But just as the destruction of Nineveh served God's timing and purpose in history, miraculously, and this is what I find really cool, that served his purpose when it was destroyed, and it absolutely served God's purpose once again when it was rediscovered. Only after this criticism emerged, became established as the consensus, and then even moved to becoming the prevailing view, only then did God allow Nineveh to be rediscovered again. The discovery of Nineveh completely flipped the academic approach to biblical history. It forced secular historians of the time to realise that absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, transforming the Old Testament text from being viewed as a book of purely religious myth to a remarkably accurate, I would say wholly accurate, geographic guide to understanding the ancient Near East. And not only that, but for the agnostic or the atheist, it forces the question of how to answer the reality of the Bible, continually vindicated across time as historically true. Because today in our own times, arguments of absence of evidence are still being answered by the Bible as archaeology catches up with what the Bible has said already. And science does this too. A great quote from many years past was, I can't remember the prominent person, I'll have to look that up. He said, when scientists finally plumb the depths of all that is to see and climb the great mountains of knowledge, they may find a group of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. And in science, from the revolutionary discovery last century that the universe had a beginning, the existence of dimensionality and string theory beyond our four-dimensional universe, what the Bible would describe as eternity, to the ability of and the reality that our universe is being stretched out, that space can be folded, all of these discoveries uniquely written into the Bible already. The Bible can be proven. It can be proven historically, scientifically, spiritually, experientially. But that doesn't mean you believe it. So why do we believe the Bible? Because it's true. And if any of us don't know that, if any of us have not come to see the Bible for what it is, if we haven't come to see that it is true, the beauty of it, the specificity of it, the revelation of the Almighty Creator God to each of us as His created people, it's time for us to open it and explore it and discover that for ourselves.